March 16, 37 AD. The body of Tiberius, old and feared, lies cold in Capri. In Rome, the news races through streets and forums like lightning. At last, the oppressive regime that had suffocated the city for 2 decades had come to an end. The Romans poured out to celebrate with flowers, cheers, and tears of relief. Hope had a name, Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, the young son of the beloved general Germanicus. For the people, it was almost a rebirth of Augustan glory. They had waited far too long for a young, charismatic emperor with the blood of heroes in his veins. The new prince entered the capital like a star. They hailed him as our baby, our chick, our little Germanicus. The contrast with the gloomy Tiberius could not have been greater. Caligula seemed to bring the dawn after a long night. But what Rome did not yet know was that, behind that radiant smile, there hid a spirit scarred by tragedy and shaped in the shadows of Capri. The emperor they welcomed with jubilation would soon be remembered as one of the most feared names in the entire history of the empire. Year 12 AD. In the military camps of Germania, on the very frontier of the Rhine, a child was born destined to inscribe his name, or rather, his nickname, into history, Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus. His father, Germanicus, was the most beloved general of Rome, a victor in battle and the natural heir to the people's trust. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was a direct descendant of Augustus. With such a lineage, Gaius seemed predestined for greatness. But what marked him was not his official name, but a childish detail. Dressed in a miniature custom-made armor, wearing tiny soldier's boots, Caligula, the boy became the army's mascot. The legionaries, charmed to see him strutting among them like a miniature version of his father, affectionately began to call him Caligula, which means little boots. No one could have suspected then that this innocent nickname, born of laughter and camaraderie, would eventually turn into a synonym for terror, excess, and madness. Germanicus was no ordinary general, he was Rome's pride. His victories in Germania had restored the empire's confidence after the disaster of Teutoburg, and his charisma was so great that the people saw him as Tiberius' natural successor. But in 19 AD, while commanding troops in the east, Germanicus suddenly fell ill in Antioch. High fevers, convulsions, a relentless decline. His death shook the empire to its core. Tragedy did not come alone. Rumors quickly spread: had he been poisoned? Many pointed to Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, governor of Syria, accused of acting under Tiberius' secret orders. Though it was never proven, suspicion lodged deeply in the collective memory. The emperor had feared his popular heir too much. For little Gaius, the loss of his father was devastating. Germanicus had been not only a military model but a symbol of honor and justice. With his death, what remained for his family was persecution and suspicion. Agrippina, his mother, never believed in a natural death. She was convinced Tiberius had ordered the assassination. From then on, young Caligula learned a lesson he would never forget: in Rome, power was not inherited, it was seized. After Germanicus' death, Agrippina the Elder became a whirlwind of grief and fury. She sought not comfort, but justice. In every gesture, in every speech, she accused Tiberius of murdering the most beloved man in Rome. Her struggle was not just political, it was personal. But in an empire ruled by suspicion, defiance was dangerous. The emperor saw Agrippina and her children as a threat to his power. Gradually, imperial attention turned into persecution. In 29 AD, tragedy struck with full force. Agrippina was arrested on charges of treason and sent into exile on the island of Pandateria, a cold and desolate place. There she would spend her last years, consumed by hunger and despair. Her eldest sons, Nero and Drusus, fared no better. They were imprisoned, tortured, and executed. In a decade, the line of Germanicus was reduced to ashes. Only Gaius remained, the youth nicknamed Caligula. At just 17, he had watched as his mother and brothers were destroyed by the very system meant to protect them. That experience marked him forever. Rome was not a cradle of greatness, but a battlefield of betrayals where only the most cunning survived. In 31 AD, Caligula's fate took a grim turn. Tiberius summoned him to his side on the island of Capri, a natural paradise turned into the emperor's retreat, but also into his laboratory of perversion. What was meant to be an idyllic refuge facing the Gulf of Naples was, in reality, a stage for intrigues, orgies, and psychological experiments. Tiberius had filled Capri with corrupt philosophers, flattering courtiers, and executioners disguised as servants. It was a closed world where power knew neither limits nor shame. For 6 years, young Gaius lived alongside that aging emperor who delighted in humiliating men and women alike. Capri was an academy of cruelty, and Caligula absorbed every lesson. He learned that human dignity could be shattered like clay, that sex could be a weapon of control, and that fear was more effective than the sword. The most disturbing thing was his ability to adapt. While other courtiers fell into madness or despair, Caligula thrived behind a mask of obedience and charm. He smiled, served, applauded, and in silence, stored away every dark lesson. Suetonius tells us that Tiberius once said, "I am raising a viper for the Roman people." It was a prophetic warning. The child who had lost his family was mutating into something far more dangerous, a young man who understood that absolute power had no moral break. On March 16, 37 AD, Tiberius died in his villa on Capri. The chronicles disagree, some say he expired of natural causes, others that Caligula, tired of waiting, ordered him smothered with a pillow. What is certain is that by dawn, the old emperor no longer breathed, and Rome was in the hands of a 24-year-old youth. The news spread like wildfire. After years of fear and repression under Tiberius, the Roman people burst into jubilation. Caligula was no stranger, he was the son of the beloved Germanicus, the child who had grown up among soldiers, the heir of a noble line. The hope of a rebirth seemed embodied in him. When he entered Rome as emperor, the streets overflowed. Crowds hailed him with affectionate nicknames, "Our baby," "Our star," "Our chick." His father's veterans wept to see the general's son made Caesar. It was a welcome no emperor had received since the days of Augustus. In his first months, Caligula responded with calculated gestures. He freed political prisoners, restored confiscated properties, and organized grand games. He seemed like a close ruler, almost a savior. Rome believed a new golden age had begun. But beneath that radiant facade lurked the echo of Capri. The viper raised by Tiberius was ready to bear its fangs. At the start, Caligula appeared to fulfill every expectation. Rome, weary of Tiberius' gloomy silence, was dazzled by a young, charismatic, generous prince. He decreed amnesties for political exiles, returned seized estates, and opened the city gates to public celebrations. The circus and amphitheater once again filled with spectacles, gladiators, and chariot races. For the people, it felt as if lost joy had returned. The soldiers were not forgotten either. Caligula granted them generous bonuses and privileges, ensuring the army's loyalty. He knew that popularity in Rome rested not only on bread and games, but also on the sword. Even the Senate, traditionally distrustful of new emperors, was surprised by his apparent moderation. For a brief moment, Rome believed it was ruled by a benevolent leader, heir to the Augustan spirit. But that brilliance concealed shadows. Behind every gesture, Caligula was testing how far he could go. His public smile was the perfect mask for a far more ambitious and dangerous plan. While the people celebrated his generosity, Caligula began to move the pieces of a darker game. At the center of this new board was not the Senate or the army, but his own blood, his 3 sisters, Agrippina the Younger, Livilla, and Drusilla. In an unprecedented act in Rome's history, the emperor ordered that official oaths include their names alongside his own. He had coins minted bearing their portraits, an honor reserved for goddesses or empresses. At imperial banquets, he ensured they sat at his right hand, relegating his wife to the background. But the most disturbing thing was not the protocol, but the rumor. Whispers began to spread through the corridors of the Palatine. Had he taken his closeness to them too far? Suetonius, always alert to the prince's excesses, would later write that Caligula practiced a public stuprum with his sisters, a deliberate transgression of Rome's most sacred norms. Among them all, Drusilla held a special place. Not only did she share with him an emotional intimacy born of family tragedy, but Caligula began to treat her as if she were his true consort, granting her honors and privileges greater than those of any official wife. Rome, long accustomed to excess, began to feel scandalized. What had once been a beloved emperor was now revealing a disturbing face, that of a ruler who used transgression as a tool of power. Of the three sisters, Drusilla became the center of Caligula's universe. She was not merely his middle sister, she was his confidant, his constant shadow, and, according to chroniclers, his true companion in both bed and power. Rumors ceased to be whispers when the emperor raised her above all the women of Rome. He granted her honors reserved for empresses, she took part in public ceremonies, was consulted in political matters, and sat beside him as though she shared the throne. To many, Drusilla was the true first lady of the empire. But the story reached its most disturbing point in 38 AD, when Drusilla died at only 21 years old. Sources claim it was due to sudden illness, though others suspected poisoning or conspiracy. For Caligula, it was a personal catastrophe. The young emperor plunged into overwhelming grief, he locked himself away for days without eating or speaking to anyone, and when he emerged, it was to make an unprecedented decision. He declared Drusilla a living goddess. He ordered temples to be built in her honor, organized a funeral that rivaled the most lavish military triumphs, and proclaimed that anyone who failed to venerate her would be guilty of sacrilege. The people then understood that Caligula's grief was not merely human, he had crossed into divine obsession. Rome was no longer ruled by a Caesar, but by a man who believed he had the power to create gods at will. After Drusilla's death, something broke irreversibly in the emperor's mind. Mourning turned into delirium. Caligula was no longer content to be Caesar, he began to proclaim himself a living god. He ordered that statues of himself be placed in temples throughout the empire, not as a remembrance of a ruler, but as objects of worship. He commanded artists to portray him with the thunderbolts of Jupiter, the trident of Neptune, the attributes of all the Olympian gods, depending on his mood of the day. In Rome, parts of the imperial palace were transformed into sanctuaries. The people were required to attend daily sacrifices, and anyone who showed the slightest sign of doubt was accused of sacrilege and executed. For Caligula, worship was not an honor, it was an obligation. This cult of personality not only drained the economy, with temples, colossal statues, and lavish ceremonies, it also unleashed terror. Senators, nobles, and common citizens knelt more out of fear than faith, knowing that any misinterpreted gesture could cost them their lives. Most troubling of all was his justification. As a god, he said, his actions, including the most scandalous with his sisters, could not be judged by human laws. The emperor had turned his religious delusion into an absolute instrument of power. Rome, which had once hailed him as a beacon of hope, now felt it was living under the shadow of a deified tyrant. The mask of benefactor had fallen. With his divine proclamation, Caligula unleashed a spiral of decisions that ruined the empire and spread fear through every corner of Rome. The treasury he had inherited from Tiberius, full at the beginning, was emptied in mere months on temples dedicated to his own image, enormous spectacles, and banquets where abundance turned grotesque. To compensate, he imposed crushing taxes, confiscated senatorial estates, and even auctioned off gladiators and palace furniture. The aristocracy, humiliated time and again at banquets where Caesar seized wives and compared them publicly, felt like prisoners. The Senate, stripped of all dignity, served only as an echo chamber for his delusions. The people, once his allies, began to suffer. Inflation, confiscations, and religious repression ruined merchants and farmers. The spectacles were no longer enough to mask the hunger. Even the Praetorian Guard, his supposed bastion of security, began to resent him. He called them his armed slaves and mocked their commanders with humiliating passwords. Among them, Cassius Chaerea harbored a silent hatred that would soon turn into conspiracy. By the year 40, Rome was united in something unthinkable: senators, soldiers, and the people all agreed that their emperor was no longer a ruler, but a threat to the survival of the empire. January of the year 41 AD. Rome burned with rumors. Ruined senators, humiliated praetorians, and fearful courtiers had woven an impossible web of alliances, all agreed that Caligula's madness had to end. The plan was simple and deadly. The emperor was to die during the Palatine Games, when he would pass through a narrow corridor that momentarily separated him from his guard. There, a group of praetorian officers, led by Cassius Chaerea, would wait with drawn swords. On January 24, the trap closed. Caligula advanced confidently, convinced of his own divinity, while joking with the few attendants escorting him. He thought it was another theatrical act when Chaerea stepped in front of him. He only realized the truth when the first blade sank into his flesh. The conspirators delivered more than 30 stab wounds to the man who had declared himself a god. His blood ran across the marble corridor, staining the very palace where he had humiliated so many. His wife, Caesonia, and his young daughter were executed minutes later to erase any dynastic claims. The living god died like any mortal, begging for his life. Rome fell silent. The crowd did not know whether to celebrate or weep. Some of the poor remembered him as the emperor who had given them bread and spectacles. The aristocracy, in contrast, breathed a sigh of relief. The terror had ended, but its shadow would forever mark the memory of the eternal city.